Hi there, hello, my name's Lines, it's great to see you. Now today's lesson, we're going to be going over how to draw eyes. So we'll be going over how to shape them, how to shade them, what they are and how they work, and also we'll go through how to make stylized eyes with different sorts of layouts and shapes, and how to apply those into a finished illustration and the steps you can take to fully render an eye, or two, in any of your drawings. We'll then also take those steps and use them within the context of a complete professional illustration, going all the way from sketch through to line art, then to colouring, and finally shading and post-processing. And I'll talk through the steps as we go. Now I'll also be including a homework sheet, which will have a space where you can make your own eye designs and apply them to a head that we've already pre-drawn. Once you've done that, please take your homework and drop it into the Discord. We've got a lot of people there who've been sharing their homework, and it's been great. And if you like what you see here and like to see it more often or more reliably, consider becoming a member on our Patreon. And with that then, let's get stuck in. So first, what is an eye? Now, as kids, we probably all drew eyes in a lot like this. Almond shape, circle, some sticks for lashes. But what they actually are is an entire sphere with a round section in the middle of it, and it's enclosed by eyelids. Now, the thing about the eyelids is they're also not just enclosing, they're asymmetrical. The eye on each side will be a different shape. And the shape isn't just almond, it'll have a few distinct sort of ridges to it. Also, unless you're drawing eyes exactly front on, there's going to be some foreshortening, which means the eye will be a different size and shape, well the opening, when you draw it. So it's important to understand that, so when you draw eyes, you can draw them from more than one angle. Because even this one you can see here in the demo, it's fairly front on, but the difference in width of the eyes and how we draw them is about 2/3. So it can be a really big thing to understand that foreshortening. So let's draw a can then to demonstrate this. And let's imagine we have a stripy label with some eyes on it that we want to put around that can. So to draw that, you'll notice the stripes get narrower and narrower as they get towards the edge of the can. And if we draw the eyes there, you can see the eye that's closer to the edge is narrower by about 1/3. But if you draw them closer to the edge still, that difference becomes even more pronounced. And that's important to keep in mind when we draw the eye. So now, the other thing is that eyes aren't flat. Eyes themselves are round inside the round head, and they themselves will have foreshortening when they're viewed from the side. So similar to how the edges of the can, the stripes get narrower, the same thing's going to happen on the eyes as well within the head. So let's draw an eye line that's curved, and then the eyes themselves as well, which are also curved. And then with that in mind, if we draw the eye, keeping that foreshortening in, and tucking in those edges at each of the corners of the eye, we'll get a much better, more three-dimensional shape to the eyes when we draw them. And we'll go over the steps as well later on, like how to make the eyelashes, how to get the direction, and that kind of thing. For now, I just want us to have a look at the way the eye shapes. And you can see it pulls in at those corners because each of the eyes is a round object, and they're on the head, which is also a round object. So then, thinking about the eye itself. So you can see that it's a ball with an opening, and then when we move that opening to the sides, when we draw it, the eye opening becomes a lot narrower in how we draw it, because some of it will actually go around the ball. And this isn't just true left to right. You'll also have the same effect when the eye is looking up or down. So you can see with the eyeball going up, the arc goes up and gets quite narrow. And so then when we draw the eyes on the figure, the same thing will be true. They'll have a much stronger sort of upward arc to them. Even though they look like they're not bent, they are bent quite a lot because we are viewing them from very far down below, and that's why the other features are changed as well. And this is where a lot of the more sort of common problems come from with drawing eyes. So this one's one of the more common ones where you'll see someone draw a head from the side, but the eye will be drawn from the front. And you can see the eye looks so much better when you draw it with a different shape because of that viewing angle from the side. It just doesn't work with a front-on one. Now, this is a very common mistake, and a fairly old mistake. People have been making this particular error for quite a while. So then, let's have a look at two heads, roughly the same sort of shape and face. And what we'll do is we'll have the same eye, the same sort of eye shape, but we'll view them from different angles. So you can see here we're doing the eyeballs. You wouldn't actually draw the eyeballs in when you're drawing them like this, you just leave the opening, but it's important to conceptualize those eyeballs as shapes when you're drawing the... So now, let's draw the openings that we see those eyeballs through, and we'll do sort of kind of narrow, sort of cat-like eyes, very almond-shaped eyes. But you can see on the one on the right-hand side, that narrow little close, we're going to have more of a sort of a Pac-Man shape because of how it's viewed from the side. And now we pop the lashes on, put the folds on above and below the eyes, and you can see now that the shape of the eye from the side really does need to be changed, otherwise it won't communicate well, but it can still be the same style of face, it can still be the same style of eye and drawing, but you need to make those changes, even in very stylized drawings. I'm starting with a semi-stylized one here, just so we can illustrate some of those points. And you can see how much the shape changes as well when you view them from the side, not just the size, but the shape also. Now, the other thing to consider is, since the iris is a round shape on the ball, as you view it from more extreme angles, like up or down, you'll notice that the iris needs to narrow. So it'll go from being a circle to being a more oval shape, and a flatter and flatter oval the more it moves and looks to each of the sides. Now you'll also notice that the pupil doesn't go out with it. The pupil actually tends to dig in, and we'll cover that in a second. And here, if we draw the eyelids on, you can see how that's supposed to work on an eye when you actually draw the eyelid on it. Now, let's have a quick chat about how to do the eyelashes. As a simple rule, the top eyelash is thicker, and both eyelashes are thicker when they get further to the sides, to the outer edge. Now, the other thing you can remember is the lower eyelash doesn't actually need to be connected to the eye. This is because the eyelashes actually come out from the edge of the lip of the eyelid, and when you're looking at the lower eyelid, you'll see it from a higher angle, so you're more likely to see that separation, but you don't need to show it. The other thing to remember with the eyelashes is they all radiate outwards from the central point of the eyeball. So you can have them all going off to the side if you want, that's fine. Now, rhythm is how you break up the eyelashes. So, here's an example of rhythm. We'll have the same elements, 3 triangular mountains and 2 clouds. One doesn't look like a scenery, the other one does, because we've differed the size, shapes, and distances of the mountains and let them overlap, and the clouds all have different sizes to the little bumps around them. They're the same visual elements, but if you apply rhythm to them, you can take them from being just shapes to being an actual bit of scenery. This same rhythm is something we talked about in the hair tutorial, in how to give organic shapes to things. So try not to have too many regular shapes to the eyelashes. If you do though, that can actually create a kind of interesting thing with eyelashes. You'll see with very stylized eyes, often they'll have them intentionally very evenly spaced apart. It doesn't look natural, but it can look very strong and striking. So it's worth considering that sometimes you may want to go with an artificial rhythm if that's what you want to communicate. Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on is the shape of the eyeball, in how we will draw it. This is not to say this is how the eyeball is actually shaped, but when we're drawing the eye, the ball itself, so the white of the eye, the sclera, we'll draw that just like a normal sphere. However, the iris and the pupil, we're going to draw them as though they are concave. They are not concave, but we are going to draw them as though they are. It's an effect of the lens and the front sort of chamber of the eye that makes them look like that. But for the purposes of illustration, we're just going to keep it in mind for the concave section of the iris has a shadow on the top and the eyeball has a shadow on the bottom. Now, let's talk a little bit about the shadows on the eye and where to shade them. So let's use our little grid there to just quickly shape out where we want the eyes to be. We'll smooth the lines out. We'll draw in the details like the eyelashes and the iris and little fold for the eye and the lower eyelashes as well, and then the pupils. So these are our basic lines. So now, where do we want to put our most common shadows? So the first one is, there's a little shadow that you get just below the top eyelashes. They cast a little shadow like a little visor. Now the next bit of shadow you want to put on there will probably be the shadow of the actual eyeball itself, because remember, it's a round object, it's a sphere. You're getting a little window into it. Then we'll put a bit of base shading on the iris, because the iris will tend to be darker than the sclera, of course. And keeping in mind that sort of, I've heard people refer to it as a sort of Death Star shape, we'll do some shading on the iris, but since the top part of it is concave, the shadow will be in the upper part of the iris. And since that light is from above, which is why we have that cave-like shadow on the iris, that also means that the highlight will be above it as well. So the highlight will always be over the top of the darkest section of the iris, because the highlight's bouncing off the light source, just like the shadow is being cast because of that light source. So that's how we'll structure the shading on the eye. Now you can make those highlights even more pronounced and ridiculous if you want. That's entirely up to you. That's whatever's just being reflected in the eye. If you want to make them more extreme, you can even add a little dark outline around them too to make them pop. So now let's do a few stylized eyes, and we'll really sort of structure them and make it a little bit easier on ourselves and start with some base shapes and smooth them out as a sort of starting point. You don't have to include these in your drawings, but it can be a good way of conceptualizing it in your head so you can figure how to shape them by thinking of them broken up into measurements. So here's a more sort of cat-like one, and so we'll do that one so it's bigger towards the edges, but then next to it we'll do a sort of more sleepy, gentle one where it tends down more towards the sides, and then we can do a sort of childish, very simplistic one that's just one big bow there. And remembering that the eyelashes are thicker on the side, bottom left we've got a more sort of sleepy, cranky one. We've then got a more sort of semi-realistic almond shaped one in the bottom middle, and then just a simple circle. You'd be surprised how many successful and iconic shows just use simple circles. Now adding the iris in, big irises are cuter, small irises are more sort of mature or more sort of serious looking, and then we'll add the pupil and two little shapes up there just for saving ourselves some time when we're dropping in the shadow. So basic shade for the iris, and then once we've done the basic shade, we'll do a second bit of shade there for the pupil, and then that shadow that gets cast over the concave area of the iris. And then with that, we can just finalize some of the darker bits there and thicken some of the eyelashes. And then add a bit of shading and highlights, just like we did in the previous one. And you can see there, they're already coming across quite well, even though they're very simple. And you can see that that shape, that 2x3 grid, does still apply to them. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is if you're doing really sort of cutesy characters, sometimes you're better off just omitting details. So have like a cute chibi or a childlike character, having too much detail on the bottom lashes, or having too much detail even on just the top lashes, can give you the wrong sort of impression. Sometimes you'll do better with a cuter, sort of simpler way of drawing the eyes. Sometimes that detail won't necessarily add anything, so do think of whether maybe being restrained is what you want to do. So next thing then, let's use a couple of these, and we'll go through quickly how we would turn these into fully rendered eyes. This will be part of the speed paint later, but that'll be like coming back to the eye in steps. I'll do the inking for one bit, the rest of the body, coloring one bit, the rest of the body. So let's just do all the steps in a row just on the eyes here. So I'll do the inking for the eyes. So just some simple line art. You can save yourself a bit of time by using the lasso tool. It gives a really nice sort of clean, hard black line. For eyelashes, it can be very handy, at least as a sort of starting point for them. And now we'll fill in and do our flats on them. So remembering that the sclera isn't pure white. So even very pale colours on a white background like this will look quite dark. So we'll put a very pale grey there, and then just a basic colour for the eye. So we'll start with a sort of a warm brown, and we'll do the shadow along the top for the eyelash shadow, and then a little bit of shading on the underside for how round the eyeball is. We'll clean out that bit of shading on the bottom part of the iris because it's concave, add the shadow to the top part of the iris, and you can see even with just those simple steps, a sort of very level 1 eye there. And if we just add a bit of detailing to the iris, so add a bit of shading to the non-shaded areas and delete a bit of shading from the shaded areas, and make sure all those lines point directly into the center of the pupil. Now, the next thing we want to do is probably the last one if you're doing very simple eyes, is just throw a little bit of a highlight over the top. Remembering that the highlight will be over the top of that shaded section. And you can stop there if you want, but there are some other steps you could take. If it's more of a sort of close-up shot, like you can duplicate the shine layer and blur it to give it a bit of a glowy shine. You've got some other options like feathering out the edges of the shading in the iris. There's also a few other things you can do, like adding a second sort of color to the inside of the iris. Remember that you don't want to just do a lighter version of the same color. You'll typically do a lighter or cooler color that's fairly close to the color of the iris to do a bit of a variation, not so you've got more contrast, not just contrast in tone, but you'll also have some contrast in color. Because the more different kinds of contrast you can put into them, the more you can pull focus on the eyes. And eyes are a great thing to use as a focal point. Then you can just grab the lasso, grab some nice, sharp, crisp sort of shapes, and then with a very soft airbrush, you can go over them in like a blue tone or a contrasting color, just to give it a bit of a glassy finish. And then you can, if you also want, there's another bit of flair, add a bit of reflected light on the inside of the eyelashes, just to give it that impression that it's lit. And that's them. So, what's another thing I want to talk about is how, of all the rules we've gone over, both in this video and all the other videos, I did want to sort of touch on the idea that there are a lot of rules, and it's important to remember that no rules matter. Rules are made up, you can break them, and you probably should. So let's go through a couple of examples of rules that don't matter. So here's a face we've drawn, and we'll have things like the eyes are spaced apart with into thirds, with an even space between them. The eyebrows are thicker towards the center. The ears, the top of the ear lines up with the midpoint of the eye, and the nose and mouth are nice and evenly spaced down the face. But what if we put the eyebrows around the wrong way? Maybe we'll do it so the eyebrows are thicker at the sides, and maybe we'll make the eyes too narrow and in together. And maybe we'll move the nose and mouth too far down the head. And we'll move the ears too far up the head, because this character wouldn't even be able to wear glasses, so the ears are definitely the wrong spot there. And let's make the mouth and nose really narrow. Even though on a male character, you want to make sure the nose and mouth are wide to be clear. And now, through all those things that are against the rules, we've got Goku, which is an excellent and, everlastingly iconic design. Similarly, here's Cardcaptor Sakura. We've got the surface of her eye is concave. She has a negative curvature to her eyeball. It just makes no sense. But the show is beautiful and iconic for being so beautiful. Or let's imagine an eyeball with a tiny, bizarre little iris on it. And to make matters worse, let's add a second bizarre little iris on this giant eyeball. Great, you now have Sonic the Hedgehog. And again, one giant merged continuous eyeball, which I can only assume is the entirety of his head wrapped in whatever horrifying blue simulacrum of skin. And the worst thing is, he's the fastest thing alive, so you can't escape. Alright, so let's get started then on the speed paint section. So we'll start out with just the basic figure. So we're going to have a fairly close-up figure. So I'm going to go with just the sort of head, shoulders, maybe a bit of the waist. We're going to do a bit of a short stack Goblin girl, just because they're fun to draw. And we'll try for a very eyes-focused illustration. But since we're trying to point out the strength of good eye illustration, we're going to give the eyes a run for their money as far as being the focal point of the illustration goes. So we're going to give it some other areas of interest to try and pull focus away. And we'll see if we can have the eyes win, as it were. So, starting with just the head and eyes there, you can see I've got the eyes that are half closed, and that's those folds of the eyes. So as the eye narrows, that eye crease will stay in the same spot, because that's just the part where that eye fold starts. So if the eye's narrow, that eye crease is going to get much further away from the eye, or rather the top eyelid's going to get further away from it. And we'll add some eye makeup, some mascara, just to colorize that eye fold to better illustrate it. Now I've got the hands here coming up, and we're going to have a sort of a top-down view. So we'll have the hair spilling out around the character, and we're going to have them in maybe like a night dress, like pajamas, and maybe even a cute little sort of pom-pom night hat, and curling some hair around to frame the face. And there's those sort of the anime hair intakes, and just curling them around. We're just starting with very, very simple shapes here. We're going to feather and detail the hair when we come back to it. And similarly with the hat, we're just going to do a very basic shape for it. We don't want it to be too sort of tight or too detailed, because again, we want the details in there, but this illustration is going to be all about pulling focus towards the eyes of the character as our main sort of takeaway. Now, we're starting to go over and shape some of the parts of the hair there, and just going in and resizing some elements of it, moving some of the facial details around, and moving the body around, just essentially just changing the shapes of some of the parts of it. I stopped drawing and came back to it after a bit of a break, and then everything was just completely in the wrong spot. So that does, I guess, segue nicely into one thing that's important to do is when you're drawing a big sort of full illustration, take regular breaks, drink plenty of water, but also reset your perspective. It's important you don't get too stuck into a drawing to see the issues that are going with it. So flip canvas constantly, take regular breaks. If you can't take a break from that drawing, take a break from that area of the drawing and go draw a different part of it, work on some detail in a different section. That way you can come back to the part that's giving you trouble with fresh eyes. Now, speaking of eyes, we're just doing a bit of a sort of test here, just throwing some tone on there and some shine on like how we plan to get to the image, to the finish line on the image, and then deciding what we're going to do with things like the lower lashes, so a little separate, little stylized triangle there to pop that out. And then trying to figure out how to get the hair to spill around the shoulder there. Maybe adding some earrings. I'm not sure if pom-pom earrings are a thing, but it sort of goes with the hat, so it kind of ties it together a bit thematically. And it's kind of soft as well, so we want to have like softness as the key visual element in this image. So we're going to have the same sort of theme of things that are soft. And we're going to continue that on the pom-pom, on the earrings, and other parts as well. Now, we'll refine some of those curves there as well, and some of the creases, and just redo that pom-pom again so it's got the same sort of shape language as the earring pom-poms, just because if they have a different sort of language, they're tilt. And then a little light source, so it's one of those sort of old-timey kerosene lamps. And here I'm just going and doing a quick test with very, very simplified shadows, just to sort of plan out what I want to do before I get into the actual one. So I'll quite often do a bit of test shade like in my sketches, where I'll get a base tone of that pale pink, and then I'll shade over it another layer of pink, and then I'll cut some of it out for highlights, just to sort of see whether things are going to work, whether I like the look of it, whether I need to rethink it. But the lantern off in the corner seems like it's working. So now I'll start on my line art. So just per usual, my line art is just a standard default hard round brush. It's the same brush I use for basically everything. So it's in every bit of drawing software. It's the same brush. It's a hard-edged round brush with pressure controlling opacity. I have two variants I've made, one with smoothing on and one with smoothing off, because I didn't like having to switch smoothing, so I just made two custom brushes that are the default brush with a different level of smoothing. And then just adding those details in for there and just pulling that bit down so I can have a bit of a narrower section for the string. And then doing the hat, just some very simple folds. Again, I'm going to describe a lot of the shape with the clothing, like the hat, using tone rather than using actual like line art for it. And also don't want to have too much detail outside of the eyes and face, because detail is something that will pull focus. So for instance, if I put too much detail in the shading on the hair around spilling around the edge of the character's face would then be fighting for attention with the hair. So I want to make sure I'm not sort of competing against myself by putting too much effort into parts that aren't where I want the viewer to be focused. And here I'm drawing the little lantern-y thing. I've got an actual reference from some garbage little Temu one. That seems to be working okay. It's a much better shape. Sort of reminding myself to get a reference. I'm not, like most people outside of the 1800s, I'm not very familiar with little kerosene lamps. And so now I'm just going over and doing the line art for the eyes. I'm not going to fill in the black sections of it. The reason for that is I'm going to leave that for when I do the second pass of my inking, which is where I add a lot of my darker spots and fill in any black areas like the eyelashes, and also sometimes like if I've got a really deep shadow I want to add like under the chin. Now I'm going to put the Clip Studio Speedpaint over the top here just because it's a bit hard on the brain to watch, and you can see it's just going over and adding those little black bits to all of the sort of creases and ambient occlusion areas. And now I'm adding the skin tone in. And going forward, now the outfit is going to be white. It's just, you don't paint in white. You want to give yourself a little bit of room to go up and down. So even a very pale grey will look very dark over white. So I'm just sort of trusting that that's not going to look as dark in the final illustration. And so I'm giving them a sort of yellow sclera to make them look a bit more monstrous. In people it means a vitamin deficiency, but in this it looks cute, not sure why. And then going for just a simple little sort of log stand thing, and maybe a grassy background for what they're on, like maybe they're out camping. And trying to just be really muted with the colours I use there. Again, I don't want to pull attention away from the focal point. So I'm going to use very muted colors for anything that isn't the focal point. So then starting on my shading, I'm going to use my shading layer to imply a bit of grass there. It's going to be blurred out and out of focus later on, so I just need to have the implication functional rather than actually have any real detail to it. And you can see here I'm doing most of my shading in this piece with the lasso tool. The lasso tool is really good, just put some high smoothing on it, and it's a really great way of carving out regions for shading very quickly. Okay, just doing a bit more lasso there, and once all of that is lassoed, we can then go on and get a soft brush, like a soft airbrush, to go in and fill in all those areas. So I'm just going to do basically the whole thing with lasso first on each area. So I'll do like the clothing, shade that in, then do the same thing on the skin tone. The reason I'm doing it to do it like region by region is that I can use the lasso tool and then I can remove from that selection each of the individual areas of color. So you can see there I'm doing the pale areas first and just getting a blending brush there to feather out some of the edges so it doesn't look too sort of mechanical and too much of a hard edge, just to mix it up a bit. And then also softening the edge on the bust part of the clothes. And then these bits I'm going to do with a brush and blender, just a standard hard brown brush, and blending brush, just for the sort of detail bits. The lasso tool is great for large sort of areas, but where you want to give that extra attention to, it can be really good to use just a regular brush as well, so it sort of fits in a different spot in the workflow. And then just trying to keep in mind mainly shading for drop shadows, so where things will be casting a shadow on each other, or where there wouldn't be much chance for light to get in. So under the chin and above the boobs there, you're not going to get very much light coming in. So that's where that would be fairly dark. And then like in the ear, or where the ear gets close to the head and it's having the shadow cast by the hair, I'm getting close in there. And then a sort of smooth shadow or sort of a darker spot on the top of the nose there to sort of indicate that the ridge of the nose sort of comes in. And then doing a bit more shading under the ear. And with that then, it's worth going on to shading the next section, which would be making sort of selections in the hair to do the shading there. So you can see the big selection I've done is the cast shadow from the sleeping cap. So anytime you have an opportunity to do a big sort of cast shadow, always take it, even if you have to sort of manufacture the opportunity, like you have the character being with a large cast shadow from something that's out of shot or out of frame. The big sort of cast shadows really sort of help place a thing within a lighting environment. And then doing a bit of shading on the underside here on the kerosene lamp. And that one, I'm planning to have that one blown out later. So I just need some very basic shadows that will be there and be sort of barely visible through the bright light I'm going to put on top. And then here, having an extra color layer. So this isn't shading. This is similar to like the blush and so forth you would do, where it's an extra color layer that sits under the shading for things like the eyeshadow. So I'm adding a bit of blue to it, but it's actually sort of more of a dark green, but relative to the green of the skin, it'll make it look like a sort of blue tone for the eyeshadow. And now adding some skin tone variation. So what I'll do is I'll select the skin tone. I'll use the skin tone as my area of selection, and then I'll get a very, very soft, very, very low flow soft airbrush and brush in some red. You could quite readily, like if this character has green skin, then you could, imagine they have green blood underneath, and so you could use like a green color. I still find red works really well. Now here I'm adding, like I did with the earlier part of the tutorial with we drew the rendered eye, I'm doing a varied color for the iris. So the top part of it's blue and the bottom part of it is a sort of orangey yellow. The reasoning for that is that I want there to be maximum attention on the eyes, so I'm going to give it maximum contrast in value, which is why it's got like the white versus big black eyelashes, and then I'm also going to give it maximum contrast on the color. So I'm going to go all the way from blue to a sort of orangey yellow, and I'm even going to do a bit more of a highlight in those eyes to take that contrast even further, to make it a really big focal point that will hopefully pull all the attention away from the other parts of the image that have a lot of visual draw. And now here you can see I'm going over with a second shading layer, just for the very darkest spots. This can be really handy just to give it a bit of depth, because sometimes you'll have a large area that's in shadow, like for instance that bit of the head that's shaded by the hat, and you'll still want to add a bit of shading to it, which means you've got to have another level of shading you can do. And you can also use it for like the darkest spots, like under the elbows, under the chin, and beside the head there. And now going over with a screen layer, just to pick up a little bit of ambient light, like an ambient sort of blue light, inside the shadows, just to give them a bit more sort of tone. And then here you can see I'm going over and doing the subsurface scattering. This is another one that I touch on in my post-processing video, where I go over how to easily apply it, and you know what it does. So this is the one that gives you that sort of red glow on the edge of shadows that helps make things look really fleshy and helps make things look really sort of translucent. And you can do it not just on skin, you can do it on a lot of different surfaces. It doesn't really make sense that it works on a lot of other surfaces, but it does still look good. So if it's something you want to do and like the look of, which I do, then by all means do it. Now here, largely the tone is in place, so it's time to start working on things like the highlights. So I'm only really going to do highlights on parts of the figure that will be close enough to or facing towards the main sort of light source, which is going to be that kerosene lantern up there. I plan to darken the whole image overall, but to start off with, I wanted to have, I guess, most of my highlights related to that light, and I'll sort of carve out the lighter areas once I've got my highlights down. I'm just sort of shaping them there, splitting them up, and going over them with an eraser just to make them a bit paler, and making sure they have a bit of a hard edge too, so they communicate that sort of smooth glossiness. Similar to what I've done with the mascara eyeshadow, and also adding some specular highlights to things like the boobs on the front there, and as well as things like, you know, the hands, the elbows, that kind of thing. And just doing more highlights there, and remembering to do sort of thicker highlights as they get closer towards that sort of key light source. And then adding a few shines in the eyes, just to sort of help them sort of look more glossy and more shiny. And then adding some more shines right on the kerosene light, because it should have probably the most, because it's the light source, so anything right next to it should be pretty blown out. And now I'm adding just a sort of more glassy kind of shine to the eyes. So this would be something that's got a hard edge, it's blue tinted and a bit lighter, and you can see going over it with that light blue tinted color gives it that sort of glassy shine. And then below that I've got a glow layer with yellow, and I'm blending that into the orange, and a glow layer will really help you sort of communicate the vibrance, and it almost does, you know, glow. And so now with that I can start adding the overall sort of atmospheric glow of the lantern, and then I'm going to darken the image with a multiply layer over the top, and then just colorizing the line art, adding a bit of a vignette. And then this one is the overlay layer, where you essentially sort of set your light hierarchy. This is another one I touch on, or all of these are ones I touch on in the post-processing video, and how to give it sort of atmospheric look and glow. The image is basically done at this point. These are just effects you drop on the top at the end that take 2 seconds, but they really, like you'll see, they can really make a bit of impact. And here I've cloned everything, and then, you know, given it a blur, and then cloned it again and put a Perlin noise layer over the top, and we're done. And then with that, we've finished. So we've got a very close-up character illustration. We've managed to pull focus on the eyes, even though there's a lot of other areas of the picture that have appeal and contrast. And overall, it works. We've got a fairly atmospheric vibe going on. And now here's the homework. So we talked about before with the stylization of eyes, and we've got a demo head that you can put that on. So have a go at that. Once you've had a go at that, pop it on the Discord, share it on there. There's a lot of other people doing the homework there as well as a lot of the old ones. There's no sort of time limit on them. And if you like what you see, and you'd like to see more of it or see it more often, then consider becoming a patron on Patreon. For those of you who have, I really appreciate it. It's made the world of difference. And otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. You have a good one. Cheers.